At the dawn of World War II, the Mitsubishi Zero fighter was the most feared fighter in the skies. But behind the legend was a grim truth. The Zero wasn't just a weapon of war, it was a death trap for its own pilots. Built without armor, without self-sealing fuel tanks, and flown under orders that demanded sacrifice over survival, the plane became a one-way ticket for thousands of young men. By the end of World War II, more than 70% of Japan's Zero pilots never returned home. This is the story of how a plane that began as a symbol of dominance in the skies became a flying coffin. In the 1930s, Japan's military leaders were planning for war across the Pacific. They needed a fighter that could fly long distances over open ocean, outmaneuver anything the Americans or British had, and protect bombers on deep strike missions. The Navy issued its requirement to Mitsubishi, a carrier-based fighter with extraordinary range, unmatched agility, and modern firepower. The man in charge was Jiro Horikoshi, a brilliant engineer who would later become Japan's most famous aircraft designer. The result was the Mitsubishi A6M Type Zero carrier fighter. The Zero. Its name came from the imperial year 2600 or 1940 in the Western calendar, the year the aircraft entered service. In Japanese, it was called Reisen, short for Reishiki Sentoki, Type Zero fighter. On paper, the Zero was astonishing. A top speed of 330 miles per hour, a range of nearly 2,000 miles, twice that of most Western fighters. It could climb faster and turn tighter than any rival in the sky, and when it first saw combat, it lived up to its promise. The Zero's first real baptism of fire came in China, before the Pacific War had even begun. In 1940, Zeros were deployed against Chinese and Soviet-supplied fighters, and they dominated. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, over 400 Zeros were in service. They swarmed the skies above Oahu, escorting bombers and strafing airfields. Not a single American fighter could stand against them. Over the next 6 months, from the Philippines to Singapore, from Burma to the Dutch East Indies, the Zero was the cutting edge of Japan's expanding empire. Allied pilots were stunned. The plane climbed like a rocket, danced through the sky, and seemed untouchable. One American pilot who faced it for the first time said, "Its capabilities are almost beyond belief. We were completely outclassed." For a brief moment, the Zero gave Japan total control of the air, but that control would come at a terrible price for the men flying it. The Zero's incredible performance came with hidden costs. To give the aircraft its unmatched agility and range, Horikoshi's team had sacrificed everything that added weight. No armor behind the pilot's seat, no bulletproof glass in the cockpit, and crucially, no self-sealing fuel tanks. So even a few bullets could ignite a fireball. This meant the Zero could turn tighter and fly farther than any rival, but it also meant it was incredibly fragile. One burst of machine gun fire, and the plane would explode. Survivors recalled Zeros vanishing in mid-air after being hit just once. The irony was cruel. The very features that made the Zero brilliant doomed its pilots. If the design flaws weren't enough, Japanese doctrine made survival even less likely. Pilots were trained under a strict code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Honor mattered more than life. Retreat was shameful. Surrender was unthinkable. American and British pilots were taught to disengage when outnumbered, to save themselves for the next fight. Japanese pilots were ordered to press the attack no matter the odds. This meant that once a dogfight began, Zero pilots almost never broke away. They fought to the end, even when the end was certain. And unlike the Americans, who rotated experienced aces home to train new recruits, Japan kept its veterans at the front lines until they died. By 1943, many of the elite Zero pilots of Pearl Harbor were gone, replaced by barely trained cadets rushed through flight school. Imagine being 19 years old, handed a machine with no armor, told to never turn back, and thrown against waves of American Hellcats and Corsairs. Most never had a chance. At first, Allied pilots were completely outmatched, but it didn't take long to find cracks in the Zero's armor. During the Battle of Midway in June 1942, American pilots discovered a fatal flaw. At high speeds in a dive, the Zero's controls stiffened, and its fragile wings couldn't handle the stress. So instead of dogfighting it, US pilots developed boom and zoom tactics. Dive at high speed, fire, and climb away before the Zero could turn. And soon, new American aircraft entered the war. The F-6F Hellcat, tough, fast, and heavily armed, could shred a Zero and still fly home full of holes. The F-4U Corsair, with its distinctive bent wings, was faster in level flight and deadly in combat. By 1943, the kill ratio was devastating. Hellcats alone destroyed over 5,000 Zeros during the war. In the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of 1944, hundreds of Japanese planes were slaughtered in a single day, many of them Zeros flown by Green Cadets. The plane that had once ruled the Pacific had become hopelessly outclassed. Behind these statistics were human stories, some of triumph, many of tragedy. One of Japan's greatest aces, Saburo Sakai, flew the Zero in countless battles. In August 1942, he was shot in the head over Guadalcanal, blinded in one eye and paralyzed on one side. Somehow, he flew his crippled Zero 600 miles back to base. He survived the war, one of the few to do so, and later admitted, "The Zero was a beautiful plane, but she was unforgiving. One mistake, one bullet, and she killed you." Most of his comrades never had the chance to tell their story. By 1944, Japan was losing the war. Fuel was scarce, pilots were inexperienced, and the Zero was hopelessly outdated. So military leaders turned to a desperate, horrific tactic: kamikaze missions. Zeros were loaded with bombs and ordered to crash directly into Allied ships. It was terrifying for the men on deck. Hundreds of planes diving out of the sun, exploding into fireballs on impact. Over 3,800 pilots died in kamikaze attacks, many of them in Zeros. The aircraft that had once been Japan's proudest weapon was now little more than a guided missile. For those young pilots, the Zero wasn't just a fragile fighter, it was a guaranteed death sentence. By the final year of the war, the Zero was no longer a threat. Allied pilots flew faster, tougher, deadlier planes. Japan's factories were in ruins, supplies were gone, but the human cost had already been paid. Of all the Japanese pilots who climbed into the cockpit of a Zero during World War II, more than 70% never came back. The Zero's story mirrored Japan's war itself. Brilliant and shocking in the beginning, devastating and tragic in the end. The Mitsubishi A6M0 remains one of the most iconic planes of the Second World War. It was revolutionary, light, fast, and graceful in the air. In 1941, it was the king of the skies, but its brilliance came at a terrible cost. To make it light, its designers stripped it of armor and protection. To make it feared, Japan demanded its pilots fight to the death. The result was a machine that killed its enemies and killed its own men just as efficiently. By war's end, more than 70% of Zero pilots were gone. The Zero will always be remembered as a paradox, a plane both legendary and tragic.